Good afternoon, people. I can see everyone is logging in and connecting, which is great. So welcome to today's Bitesize session. I'll start off by, so I'm Jennifer Sproul and I'm the Chief Exec of the Institute. And this is a topic that has been close to my heart, an area of interest for a good couple of years now, where really today what we want to do is share with you some of the latest sort of trends and those primary forces that are changing the future of work, and really then pick out them. So what does that mean for internal communication? Just as a sort of way of background, the future of work as a topic area is something we really began working on. I think it was, Kat will remind me, I think it was back in 2019 when it was pre-pandemic, if that was even a time that we can go back to. Because we were really interested at the IOIC in particularly starting to become more of a trend spotting institute to really look at where we're going so that we can help our membership understand that and also understand what the opportunity is there for us as a professional community. So during this time, since 2019, when we did our original Future of Work Trends report, which came out in April 2020, so it was a sort of on the cusp of the pandemic, which obviously accelerated a number of trends. We've done a lot of work on this topic, and we've really deep dived into some of the chapters, and we've looked at what the business case for world-class internal communication. We have our podcast series called The Future of Internal Communication, but obviously, a few years later down the road, we sort of thought, actually, perhaps we need to update that original piece of work to look at how are those trends now? What are the big trends? Because so much has changed in our lives and in the working world. So really today is to kind of share with you those updated trends and then really just get some questions from you guys. We want this to be interactive around, do those trends feel relevant to you? Are you working on them? Do you have questions around them? So just use the chat function and drop into it. But as part of this work, we've been aligned with Working the Future, who are future of work experts. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine, or Kat, I probably will start calling her throughout this. Do you want to introduce yourself, Kat?
Yes, thank you very much. So my name is Catherine, or Kat Barnard, and I am one of the partners and co-founders at Working the Future. As the name suggests, we are a future of work advisory firm. So we provide work trend intelligence to clients to educate and inform, and we also work with organisations to co-create adaptive workforce strategies that actually will help them future-proof and meet the labour markets of the future. I would add, as Jen has articulated, when we first got together, it was summer of 2019, and we thought we were being really future thinking when we agreed that we would create a Future of Work Trends report. And we got working on that in the autumn of 2019. And of course, by January, the world started to change. March, we went into lockdown. I'm glad you remembered exactly when the report got published, but I think we would both agree that our original Future of Work Trends report got mildly overshadowed by the pandemic and nationwide lockdowns and so on and so forth. And Jen's absolutely right. The pandemic has set in motion an acceleration of trends that we were tracking prior to the pandemic, but also trends that have emerged since the pandemic. And I'm sure I'm not speaking singularly for myself when I say literally every day now, if you flick on the news, it's overwhelming. It's a strange time to be alive and working and trying to navigate everything that's going on out there and create connection and community and strong communication pathways for our colleagues. So hopefully today we will just unpick. I mean, I think this is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and I would absolutely encourage all of you, if you've not had the opportunity to read the report, to download a copy and just read it. It's broken down into themes that we'll discuss today, but you don't have to eat the whole thing at once. You can just dip in and dip out. And it does complement a range of other reports that we've produced for the Institute in the meantime, mostly focusing on what that means for you working in the field of internal communication, because for me, obviously, and for Jen and everyone else that works at the Institute, we see communication, how we communicate in the workplace, as the absolute lifeblood of organisational future-proofing. So part of the reason we're doing this is to try and demonstrate to you guys just what an opportunity you have in front of you to really place yourself at the epicenter of your organisations and to really add that strategic clout that I know so many of you have spoken about.
Thank you, Kat. So without further ado, as I say, this is going to be, as Kat says, a whistle-stop tour of the report. Please do download that afterwards. Kat's going to take us through some of the trends and the top information, and I'm going to sort of chat in amongst those as we go through it. But do, as I say, feel free to drop things in the chat, ask those questions, let's get the conversation going. And also just say that we are recording it, so don't worry too much about making notes, and plus you'll have the report afterwards where all of this information is expanded upon. So without further ado, Kat, shall I pass back to you then to start taking us through the whistle-stop tour of the report?
Let's do it. Okay, so we have identified 8 trends. These are not the only trends that are impacting the way that we work, but these are the primary trends that we think are most obvious and most pressing to address in our conversations around the way in which work is changing. So cracking on then, obviously the very first topic that we want to discuss today is the impact of digital technology on the way that all of us are working. And I know from conversations with Jen that a lot of you members of the Institute have talked a lot about wanting to know and understand more about the digital communication channels and platforms that are available to amplify internal communication. And I think that is one side of quite a complex puzzle, actually. I think it's hard to overemphasize just the extent to which software and technology is changing the way that we live and work in the 2020s. This guy, Mark Andreessen, is an American venture capitalist from Silicon Valley. So his whole kind of MO is looking at emergent technology, putting funding into emergent technology, and so on and so forth. And this statement that he made is actually more than a decade old now. So, you know, the rise of Silicon Valley has been very much in play for the last 20 or so years. And I can't emphasize enough just how much money is getting invested into the development of next generation digital technology. And of course, you'll be experiencing that in your day-to-day work, I would imagine, and most of your colleagues will be as well, because whichever function of business you go into at the moment, there are new platforms and tools and applications and software that can help, that are purported to help improve the efficacy of those functions. And of course, that creates several dilemmas. The first is, we're all aware probably of the rise in potence of the narrative around artificial intelligence and automation, and I think there's several things to note in that mix. One is, yes, as this statement from PwC attests, it is going to change business, and it is going to add value to business, it is hoped, but it also changes the way that we all work. So I think we all have a very, very strong potential to end up with what I'm just going to loosely call just digital fatigue, because you're constantly trying to keep up with new software upgrades, new tools, new ways of doing things, to the point where there's a lovely quote from another guy in America, a guy called Kevin Kelly, who is one of the co-founders of a digital technology magazine, Wired magazine, has actually referred to this state of this period of time where we're all just perpetual newbies. We're forever scrambling to try and get our heads around what's happened to the technology and platforms that we were using last week. Oh my goodness, someone's introduced a new interface. I no longer know where I can find things, and so on. And it seems to be almost a weekly basis thing. So the impact on our colleagues who are continuously scrambling to try and adapt to new technologies and new ways of doing things can't be underestimated. Also, the whole narrative around artificial intelligence and automation means that some of the things that are our core day-to-day business tasks at the moment will ultimately get automated, particularly if they're repetitive and routine tasks. And on the one hand, it places an onus on us as individuals to continue to reskill ourselves to kind of replace that piece of work that's now been automated with other ways in which we can add value to our employers. That's quite stressful, being in that continuous learning zone, because you basically end up feeling largely out of your depth most of the time. But the worst side of the narrative around artificial intelligence and automation is, and perhaps you're familiar with it, perhaps you've read it, you know, this talk about, oh, a future world without work and without jobs. I mean, what the hell does that even mean for any of us? So there's a real piece here, which is stress inducing. And I feel very strongly that the role for you as internal communicators is to stay abreast of this narrative and explore ways in which you can help alleviate the anxiety of technology stressed colleagues. And I would say, you know, despite all of this tech, I think we all know that nothing beats a good old-fashioned conversation. So in parallel with this kind of tech tsunami is this need to double down on ways in which we can connect in our workplaces with colleagues in a meaningful kind of human to human way. I don't know what you would think, what you would add to that, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really technology. There's so many different, as you say, it's quite complex as a professional community. Yes, we're dealing with demands on us to implement new technology to enable communication, and the plethora of things that we do around that and how we do that is quite overwhelming. But I think that's almost one issue to the side that we need to consider. But I think for me as well, when I look at this future of work trend and where we're going, so the employee experience, as opposed to that we're trying to influence, this trend towards the decreasing engagement with upskilling. So why is that happening? What does that mean? How can we is it the pace of change that we're trying to create? Because at the end of the day, if we keep going down this path of advising more technologies, but we're not driving the engagement to want to upskill and want to see the value and the benefits of actually using technology, I think that's something to be really cautious of and conscious of when we're advising potentially leaders or change or transformation teams, because there's something fundamentally happening now where actually as employees, we're now switching off with that. And actually the narrative around, you know, everything can be automated, then sort of goes, well, how should I get involved with that? So I think there's a real messaging involvement challenge here. I mean, so I guess from your point of view, Kat, what do you think that kind of opportunity is for us as a profession, isn't it?
I think we just need to remember that technology is an enabler, but it isn't a replacement for human to human relationship building, and it never will be. You know, some of you guys might be old enough to remember life before dating apps and, you know, life before social media. And I think, you know, whilst a lot of these digital applications have brought efficiency, as in they have allowed us to connect with and interact with more people. I think the question that we need to be asking ourselves is to what extent they've improved the quality of our connections and the quality of our discourse. And I think most of us would agree that actually, when scrutinized through that lens, we actually feel less connected than we ever used to. So, you know, as regards to the whole conversation about communication channels in our workplaces, yes, those digital communication channels can help us reach more people, but we must never assume that they have helped us reach more people, because the only way that you reach more people is by meaningfully and purposefully checking in to ensure that the messages that you've attempted to communicate have landed in the way that you would have hoped to have communicated them, and that they've resonated in the way that you would have aspired to. So I would say, you know, conclusion, tech's an enabler, but it doesn't replace any of the human to human ways in which we communicate.
And I think the other thing I would just add to that, as well as an opportunity, is this, and we've touched on it as a community, we've talked about it, is how are we aligning ourselves to L&D? How are we partnering with L&D as a function? Because obviously they're charged with rolling out those programs and that learning and development and that upskilling issue. And we're over here trying to drive that sense of communication and engagement. And if they're not working together, or they're not working well as they should do, then perhaps there's an opportunity to really understand how are we supporting L&D communication.
100%, definitely. I mean, we are all in that zone now of overwhelm. So I think the communication around how we are continuously adapting as human beings has never been more important. Should we skip to the next? Interestingly, so the next subsection is that of globalization, and I do feel quite strongly that globalization intrinsically links with technology for reasons on this slide. You know, when you look at the world became much smaller once the internet, the commercial internet, arrived. And if you look at the sort of the uptake of mobile telephones, but most specifically smartphones, so mini computers in our pockets, really, you know, all of a sudden the world is hyper connected. And what that ostensibly means is, once you've got a connection to the internet through whichever means, you've got the ability to become a producer, and you've got the ability to set yourself up commercially and compete with other people, potentially as well in lower cost countries, far more competitively than perhaps it would cost us here in the West to set up and compete. So the threat of cheaper competition to organizations is continuous, and it drives ongoing demand for continuous cost efficiency, cost control, and so on, which creates stress for organizations. I'm sure many of you have had experience of having budgets evaluated, frozen, slashed, etc., etc. It creates a level of stress within the operating system that sometimes can be hard to navigate. And what that also does is, with the amplification of potential market competition, and I do appreciate some of you will be working in public sector bodies, but in the private sector, that acceleration of competition demands then that organizations must continuously adapt and innovate in order to remain competitive. And of course, lots can't, because that adaptation and innovation relies on organizational agility, which is underpinned by really coherent communication. And so what we see is that for those organisations that cannot adapt fast enough, their lifespan is shrinking. And this research has come out of the United States. Insight tracks the average lifespan of S&P, which is kind of like the, well, I'm probably telling you all how to suck eggs here, but it's another FTSE, isn't it? It's another, God, I'm having a brain fart. It's another, what is it, Jen? You're looking like you know. It's another.
It's another index.
Thank you. Oh, lifesaver. I was really struggling there. So yes, so the lifespan of organisations is reducing, and then of course, what we've realised, what we're actually in the thick of at the moment in 2022 is globalised supply chains are so fragile, and our supply chains started to experience ridiculous amounts of strain as a consequence of the pandemic and the lockdowns. And I know that there are continuous supply chain issues with the provision of technological devices, hardware, and so on, because so much of that is produced in China, and China has been going through a really extreme set of lockdowns because it has a zero COVID policy. So that's one example. Another example is obviously the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is creating huge supply chain issues for us all with food and with a whole bunch of things that we would never have considered were manufactured in Ukraine, but things like fertilizers, things like, well, I found out recently, the swimming pool that I swim at, all these swimming pool cleaning agents come from Ukraine. So again, globalized market systems are great when they're operating well and there's no kind of, glitches on the horizon. But the moment that uncertainty or, unforeseen events kick in, the whole thing starts to become way more fragile and starts to break down. So the other thing to add in is that because organisations are often seeking, or mostly having to seek, cost efficiency, many organisations have looked to outsource certain functions of their organisation to lower cost countries, which of course then creates a challenge for the field of internal communication, because all of a sudden you are needing to run your comms strategy through a culturally diverse lens to ensure context and meaning is interpreted in the right way. So what that means is if you are working within a globalized ecosystem, suddenly your intercultural understanding is far more paramount. And also I would say, again, because of where we're at right now, don't underestimate the amount of stress that all of these uncertainties are causing your colleagues. I mean, I'm sure you're stressed by it. So, if you multiply that by the number of colleagues you've got, then actually the way that you're communicating internally becomes ever more important, because people don't, in times of crisis, our ability to connect with one another is never more important. One of the worst things is to feel disconnected and isolated. I don't know what would you add in there, Jen?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think there's a couple of things in here, and this piece and all the things that you've talked about is this, it comes back to, I guess, some of that is that uncertainty, but also this piece of understanding organizationally where we're at, the marketplace, competitiveness, the pace of how businesses are now having to operate to keep ahead and to keep markets, to keep margins, to keep profit, to keep people. And of course, context is key. That's not the case for every organization. It will be contextually different. But I think that no matter of the context, for me, this kind of highlights those few opportunities, I think, that are really key for internal comms that you've touched on there, Kat. One is which is around, you talked about innovation. So therefore, for me, there's this opportunity of thinking about how do we enable innovation through communication, and how do we support that convergence, that connection, that ideation. And actually, for me, then that comes down to how do we become part of owning the knowledge economy, which is, we're not a manufacturing industry. Perhaps what we're working in is how do we think about how information and knowledge and everything else is shared across an organization. So there's a real opportunity to be part of helping to drive those workflows, those communication processes that and those structures that enable communication, that enable ideation, that enable innovation. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing around as well, which you just talked about, is actually then being just conscious of it. I think we all are. How can we not be? The news makes us conscious of it every day. But being conscious of how that feels, and of well-being and of empathy and of messaging, which is really where we've been going as a professional community anyway. But thinking about how we can put in place those things to make sure that we're sharing that dialogue, that we're supporting people, that we're tuning into that sense of being overwhelmed, and we're tuning into it. And actually, because fundamentally then to our business leaders, if we can demonstrate what we do enables or helps or plays a role in innovation, as well as then well-being, which drives that sense of retention, those are the kind of real areas where we can have a massive influence in this kind of landscape for me.
Yeah, 100% agree with all of that. Right, we better skip on, haven't we? So the third topic that we've addressed in the trend report is hybrid working. And hilariously, in the original version of this report, we called it flexible working, but clearly events have superseded us, and hybrid work is now the kind of default term used to encapsulate remote working, flexible working, agile working, distributed working. And what is most interesting for us here is that demand for the ability to work flexibly was already well in play prior to the pandemic. This report from Forbes magazine, published in 2019, in the summer of 2019, had highlighted, they'd taken data actually from a flexible work recruiter here in the UK. Gosh, I can't remember the name of it now, but and had identified just the extent to which millennials in particular were prioritising flexible working when exploring job opportunities. Now, obviously, this is caveated with, flexible working is more relevant for people who are working in the knowledge economy sector. For people that are still working in the hospitality, retail, manufacturing, there are a lot of sectors for which remote and flexible working just isn't an option. However, there is definitely a changing attitude towards work and a rise in demand for the ability to work more flexibly. So what that essentially means is the ability to work from home some of the time, and the ability to work in a way that means that you don't have to be in at 9 o'clock, and you don't have to be out, at 5 or 5:30 or whatever your working hours are. Actually, there's a lot of really interesting science, and I haven't included this in the report, but that scientists have discovered that each of us has a chronotype. And what that means is that each of us will have a rhythm to our day when we are more able to produce quality work, when our energy levels are higher, and we'll also have dips in our day. And it is actually almost extraordinary that we would ever be able to work from 9 until 5 at full force productivity. So actually, one of the things that I've done at a personal level is figured out, well, I'm actually quite a morning person, so it suits me to start my working day around 8 o'clock, and I can go pretty well until about 3. But if you ask me for a sensible conversation after 3 o'clock, you're not very likely to get one, I have to say. So So I think actually with all these gains that we're making in our understanding of psychology and neuroscience and sociology, and again, you know, the gains that we're making in the way in which we can work in a more distributed fashion, courtesy of the internet, I think we have to concede that we're at the end of a one-size-fits-all approach to employment. And what that means then is that workplaces are changing. We're starting to see higher rates of staff turnover and churn, regardless of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. I think it's just becoming more acceptable to change jobs in a shorter period of time. And of course, that creates extra pressure for organizations because organizations need employee stability to some extent. So again, it creates an additional challenge and opportunity in the field of internal comms. We need to figure out on a range of things, you know, how do we get to this state of optimal hybrid? And how do we make sure that we can engage with our colleagues wherever they happen to be? We've done quite a bit of work at Working the Future, exploring, you know, what the key ingredients are of getting to optimal hybrid. And I would encourage all of you to think, if you're involved in any conversations around hybrid, to really think about these 4 questions, because unless we're answering these questions, we're not really having a conversation about hybrid work. So for every single person who might want to work more flexibly, what is the actual work that they're doing, and where is, you know, can it be performed remotely? Where's the best place for that piece of work to be performed? Bearing in mind that that work will continuously change in line with, you know, external market forces and so on. What do the individuals want who are doing the work? What do they want now? How might their life circumstances change in, you know, the next 6 months and so on? So there's a need to continuously review this kind of stuff. And what does the organisation want and need? And who are the people that kind of come together to collaborate, to perform and deliver and produce this work? So all of those things feed into a conversation about hybrid work. And then once the pattern has been agreed, then it is down to the organisation to ensure that the communication channels are open. And I think one thing that we're really noticing, which is a massive opportunity for you guys, is the extent to which people who are working mostly remotely are reporting feeling socially isolated and or lonely. And they're also reporting working for longer. So there needs to be a very open discourse about how we connect everyone back together once the borders and the boundaries, the physical borders and boundaries have gone. And we actually also need to be having really healthy discussions with our colleagues about what is too much work and when it's time to literally power our systems down and go for a walk and stop for the day. So those are massive opportunities for you all.
Yeah, and I would just add to that as well, from what I'm hearing is, as Kat said, there's all those opportunities. We need that connection and that conversation to help us work through that all. But one of the things I'm hearing a lot of work going on is for internal comms right now, and where to get involved is with, there's a lot of, I don't know if you're all experiencing it, you might be working on it, but all this drive to really go, what is our EVP? What is our EVP? And that's great. And we can design those EVPs and we can be there together. But one of the things that I think there's an opportunity that we need to, I guess, collectively solve as well, is the challenge that I'm hearing is, how do I make an EVP live when we're so disconnected and we're so culturally different to where we are? How do we make an organization feel when we're also distributed, or and we're trying to enable preferences? So we've gone through a lot of cultural change, and we're going through that continuously. And I think there is a lot of trial and error going on. I think now, even as me, where I was quite happy over here, now I'm like, I'm tired of being a bit alone. I want to get out again. So now I want to come over here. So we have to be constantly checking in, listening. Feedback loops are the absolute key to achieving that. So that's like EVP. So we say what we're about, and then making sure we live that EVP, let it feel in a very different way. But then that thing around making sure we are building as an IC function, those feedback loops, so that we can constantly be checking in and have agility to change that and spot where things are going wrong before they happen. When we interviewed David McLeod on the podcast, didn't we? And we asked him that, and he said it's like in hybrid, employee voice is smoke detectors in your house. He said, but in the hybrid world, we need a hell of a lot more, because if you have them distributed everywhere and we can hear them when they go off, then we can quickly come in and solve. So I think it's probably for us to realize we can put in a plan. We'll probably need to keep adapting it on a much more regular basis than we perhaps previously have done.
Yeah, 100%. And that segues quite nicely into the next chapter that we explored in the trend report, which is that, we can't underestimate the extent to which attitudes are changing, not socioculturally, but also, given the vastness of age in our workforces. So we now have, what have we got? We've got Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, and Boomers working alongside one another in many organizations. And of course, they will all have different kind of sociocultural traits. But actually, I think what is the most interesting thing is this is something that Seth Godin, I don't know whether any of you have heard of Seth Godin, I hope so, but something that he wrote in a book called We Are All Weird, which I think is, 7, 8 years old. And the point that he was making is that the internet has allowed us to get in touch with our points of individuality far more succinctly than we would ever have been able to previously. We've been able to kind of find other people like us online, and that in turn then drives ever more differentiation. So we found our tribes, and then our tribes kind of fragment into micro tribes, and we all, instead of mass marketing or a one-size-fits-all approach to employment, now we are by and large far more aware of what our individual wants, needs and preferences are, and will vote with our feet to go and get them. So back to the point about employee voice being your smoke alarm, it's really important for organizations now to understand the motivations of the people that are working there. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to accommodate, because obviously there will be points at which you can't accommodate every single person's wants and needs, but having an understanding of those wants and needs helps people to feel seen and heard. And that's a massive thing, because actually all most of us want when we come to work is to feel valued and appreciated. And you can't feel valued and appreciated if you don't feel seen and heard. Feeding into that is the whole DE&I agenda that's, at the forefront of so many organizations at the moment. For me, to some extent, DE and I is in the wrong order, because I would actually put the I at the start. Inclusion, including people, whoever they are, wherever they are, for whatever they are, is so important. If people don't feel included in a conversation because they don't feel able to use their voice to share their thoughts and ideas about, topics of the day, that's a showstopper. And there you go. There's some data there from Deloitte that says that, what's 2 in 5, what's that, 40% have rejected an offer because it doesn't align with their, well, in this context, it was inclusion values. Just to note as well, with global uncertainty, you know, we've been tracking the Edelman Trust Barometer for, well, certainly the last 5 years. I don't know whether you guys do as well, but if you do, you'll have seen business is now the most trusted institution. There's been such a sense of letdown with governments in the last 5 years that business leaders are now expected to really step up and address the societal and environmental issues that we face. And again, that places an opportunity for the field of internal communication, because what we actually need to know is what matters to people, what they're thinking about, what kind of keeps them up at night. And on the one hand, that's not actually relevant to the work that's getting done, but it has everything to do with somebody's ability to motivate themselves and give their best at work each day. So, you know, even if we can't do anything tangibly to address the concerns of people, when people feel seen and heard and listened to, that makes an extraordinary difference to how somebody shows up in their working lives.
Absolutely. And you know, for me as well, obviously I talked on EVP and inclusion, we've got to get the right, and there's still, as comms professionals, there's still a lot of work to do on accessibility and on the basics on that side of things as well. But I think that the other thing I would say is, and I'm hearing this a lot right now, is to communicate is the most scariest thing it's ever been. Getting it right, doing it right, listening or tuning in or getting feedback or hearing what can feel really, really scary, particularly in such, I think, delicate, difficult times. And difficult conversation can be something we want to run away from, but I think it's something we have to lean more into. And that also, but also is, I think that takes a lot more trial and error. And I think we have to embrace that sense of trial and error to make sure that we are listening and tuning in, hearing that, going, right, okay, what does that mean? How do we flex? Do we try something a little bit differently? And really just keep ourselves to task on those things as well. That was a sort of a bit of a jumbled up approach, but for me, there's still work to do on the base. If you're talking about D&I, on the basics of that, there's still then a lot of work to do in terms of, there's this expectation now from employees that as employers or as businesses, we will have values that we live by and that we do, and that we'll have a perspective and we will fight for the right thing. But to do that, enter that space on any level, is a scary thing to do, because it opens ourselves up, has risks of reputation management, which means that our links with internal and external are ever more important. And then also from that sort of side of things as well, is then making sure, the third thing, that we're enabling hard conversations around these issues so we can understand what motivates and how people feel, so we can really build that into perhaps that empathetic tone that, or purposeful tone that we're trying to create.
Cracking. I'm gonna move on, and I'm gonna try and address 2 chapters in one here. I don't know how effectively I'm going to be able to do it, but I really want to talk about the extent to which employment itself is changing and what bearing that has on organisational structures. So, in short, one of the things that has happened as a consequence of the pandemic is that we've lost around 1 million members of the UK labour market. Part of that is people who were working over here from overseas, who obviously were locked down and unable to get back to their families for a long time during the first set of lockdowns. And so we've lost a lot of international workers who've decided that actually, you know, they'd much rather be closer to home in case of another emergency. There's also, I think it's something like 500,000 people over the age of 50 who are unaccounted for because they've left full-time employment. They're not actually claiming benefits. There's the ONS produced some data last week just showing the extent to which people over the age of 50 had left the labour market because they were feeling fine. You know, they've taken early retirement is the bottom line. But what that means is that we've got a constricted, a reduced labour market. And because of that, obviously, we all know we've got a very, very buoyant labour market at the moment. But with these kind of constrictions, organisations then become more and more dependent on non-permanent labour to get work done. And so one of the things that's really coming to the fore here is the rise of what Deloitte has called the alternative workforce. It produced some research in spring 21 with in conjunction with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and found that 87% of C-suite respondents had both confirmed that they were reliant on external workers when considering their workforce composition, but actually, more importantly to this conversation, that they lacked a good approach to communicate and manage with that workforce. And just as a little anecdote, I know somebody who works as a contractor for an organisation here in the UK, and there are various parts of the building that he's not allowed to go into because he's a contractor, which is just quite extraordinary when you think about it. But if you play that through the lens of inclusion, how is that incentivizing somebody who's off payroll but nonetheless delivering value to an organisation to actually really double down and feel part of the, you know, part of the dynamic workforce moving forward? So I think we need to open ourselves up to the idea that we have got a very, very different employment market now, and there's a whole raft of ways in which work can actually get done. I think for internal communicators, the real opportunity is to understand that full panorama of employment types and start thinking about, even if you don't do anything to begin with, but just start thinking about what that means for the way in which you communicate with everybody who makes up that talent ecosystem. And then moving forward quickly, all of that then gives rise to new and emergent operating models. So the way in which we get things done, we're moving quickly away from hierarchical command and control structures towards much more on-demand working, where teams are organising themselves without waiting for a top-down mandate from the C-suite. We're looking at things like, you know, there's been experiments going on for the last decade, at least, with holacracy and results-only work environments, and how work gets delivered in a way that is optimal, both for the agency that the individual contributors feel, but also for the agility of the organisation. With so many market forces in play, organisations will have to adapt and become far more kind of fluid and shape-shifting in order to survive. So that warrants different ways of organising people in the workplace. I say in the workplace, it might not even be a physical workplace, but of course all of those things have real tangible consequences for the way in which we choose to communicate within our organisations. And this, for the large part, is why we are working with the Institute to advise on these very, very different work scenarios. So even if you're looking at this at the moment and thinking, oh my goodness, I don't even know where to start with that, that's absolutely fine, don't worry, we're here to help. It's at this point, the whole point of bringing this to the fore is just to familiarise you with the way that, you know, with the direction of travel, if you will. Mm. Shall we crack on? Because I'm very aware of time. So another big topic that we have to track, because it's going to impact and compromise all of us, is that of climate change. I think we reached a point last year, definitely, where the fact that we have a climate in crisis became an indisputable fact. And if that wasn't enough, I mean, the climatic events that we've all seen play out this summer really kind of hammer home that fact. So what does that mean? It means we're all suffering, by and large, from eco-anxiety. And I don't think we can underestimate the fact that we're feeling it at an individual level and our colleagues are feeling it. I'm not convinced we're having enough conversation about it. I think we ought to be having more conversation about it, because that's how human beings come together to solve difficult problems. I think there's an expectation now in the labour market that organisations will step up and do their bit to confront reducing carbon emissions. And I also think that that is how sustainability, organisational sustainability endeavours actually kickstart, when people start a conversation about climate change, start a conversation about their organisation's carbon footprint, and come together. You know, all action starts with a conversation, and actually somebody within an organisation needs to step in and become the convener and the facilitator and sometimes the mediator. But, you know, if you're working in internal communication, it's not just about words on a page, it's about the art of communicating and enabling and facilitating difficult conversations. And we're definitely on our podcast going to be looking at that in a lot, you know, in much greater detail in 2023. So please stay tuned. Yeah, 84% of young adults. And I think that's what I think is really interesting about this particular fact is it was only young adults that were surveyed. I don't really think it matters what age group you belong to anymore. I think most of us are very, very concerned and worried about that aspect of you know, what's going on out there. And then to pull it all together really, really quickly, all of these changes give rise to an increased demand for humane leadership, for our leaders in our workspaces to be authentic and to be accessible and visible and just there communicating in an honest style for all participants of the workforce. You know, I don't think I'm being politically argumentative when I say our political system is in difficulty right now. And I think what that gives rise to is for all of us to want to see transparency and honesty and integrity somewhere. And I think that, unfortunately, you know, whether we like it or not, it falls on our leaders. So there's an amazing opportunity there for us as internal communicators to help our bosses, basically our business leaders, to become more vocal, more visible, more accessible, and to help them with their communication style. And, you know, in terms of adding strategic value, I would probably place that right up there and in the mix as the thing that you guys can do. And, you know, start with the leaders, but the managers need help as well. And we'll be looking at that moving forward, won't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That feels like a massive whistle stop tour. And I hope I've not kind of blown people's heads off. And the conclusion is that this is your time.
Mm.
This is your time. This is literally your moment. And that is why we're investing so much time and effort in trying to provide the materials that we can to you as a membership body in order that we can have these conversations and start to kind of try on these new scopes and roles and responsibilities for size and get more comfortable with what's going on out there. I can tell you in 6 years of running Working the Future, denial is an amazing. I've become ever transfixed by people's capacity for denial in business and not wanting to confront these trends. But I don't think we have any option but to confront these trends. And for you guys with your skills of communication. You're right in the epicenter of transformative change.
Absolutely. And the things I kind of, as we talk through that, is that this is, and all the things that, what can we do then? We can enable that personalization. We can enable those difficult conversations. We can help our leaders. We can get aligned to our people function, our OD functions, our ND functions, to our external functions. We can help change the narrative, and we can enable that to feel and to culture and to live and to breathe. All the things that we do as a professional community impact all of those things, and organizations will not survive, as we've said, if they don't embrace this. If we don't enable this, they won't have innovation, they won't have productivity, and there won't be talent retention and recruitment, all the key ingredients that we know as a community an organization needs. So we're keeping working on it, as Kat said, and up here now, these are the things that you're going to hear from us more as we start to really get into the practicalities, I guess, of these areas, isn't it, Kat, as we go forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will end by saying I can imagine that it could look quite daunting if this is new to you, but I firmly believe, with a few more grey hairs than I perhaps like, that all knowledge acquisition starts by becoming aware and paying attention, and conversation, actually. And that's what we're here to do. We're not here to tell you you're behind the curve and you've got to do all of these things now. We're just, if we can start the conversation, then clarity starts to appear, and you will naturally step into this kind of realm of organizational future proofing, just by virtue of encouraging your organization to have more dialogue around these around these topics.
Absolutely. So for us, it's what we're saying is keep learning, keep evolving. At the IOIC, what can you expect from us next? We can download the report. Like I say, this is a whistle-stop tour. In the report, there's much more data, more examples, more detail in terms of what that means for internal communication. We have got our Future Internal Communication podcast series. It's on all the major channels. So do tune in. I think we've had 4 series that are on there so far, and we're currently planning our 2023 series as well. We're going to start to get into some of those meaty topics. We're looking at lunch and learn sessions for future of work. So we're going to really dive into the details to help you enable that and embed that in your business. And there's more things. We've got some more reports and some things that we're planning to enable us to keep discussing and talking as a community. I can see you've all said some thank you. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Kat. But if no one has any questions, we will let you go after that deluge of information. And hopefully we'll see you on the next conversation that we have about this.